August 12, 1945. The war had 3 days left to burn, though none of the women marching under the brutal Pacific sun knew it yet. They were young, most in their 20s, once clerks, nurses, or auxiliaries to the Imperial Army. Their uniforms were faded, sleeves stiff with sweat, and their shoes thinned to flaps. Hollow cheeks betrayed years of rationing, while their eyes still carried the sharp pride drilled into them by an empire that demanded devotion unto death. Yet as they stumbled toward the wire of a U.S. internment site, something arrested them more than the sting of defeat or the sight of rifles pointed their way. It was the guards themselves. The Americans were not all boys. Some bore streaks of silver in their hair, others walked with the ease of seasoned men whose age should have slowed them but did not. They were in their late 50s, even 60s, men who might have been bent double with farming back home in Japan, or already shuffled aside as relics of a previous generation. But here they stood, broad-shouldered, straight-backed, their skin pink with blood well fed, their jaws still square under the shadow of a day's stubble. To the women, it felt like stepping into a world where time obeyed a different law. Whispers broke among them in low, hurried Japanese. How could men this old look so alive? One nurse, only 23 but with lines already webbing the corners of her mouth, stared at a guard chewing gum as though he had been conjured from another planet. Another woman nudged her companion, whispering that perhaps these were not ordinary men at all, but veterans returned from some secret American fountain of youth. Even in their humiliation, they could not help staring. In Japan, men of that age looked worn, their shoulders collapsed under years of physical labor and empty bowls. Rations had cut deeper each year. Rice had been stretched with millet, barley, even pine bark powder. Fish was rare, meat rarer still. By 1945, the average Japanese civilian lived on less than 1,800 calories a day. Teeth decayed from lack of nutrition, bodies shrank, energy drained. The Americans, in stark contrast, averaged more than 3,000 calories, even under rationing. To the POWs, the difference walked in front of them in flesh and bone. They expected the Americans to look powerful, yes, but not like this. Not men old enough to be grandfathers with the vitality of sons. The shock pierced their pride. It was one thing to be defeated by a nation of youthful soldiers, but quite another to see elders outshine their own youth. In the unsteady march from capture to camp, the women's minds gnawed on this contrast as fiercely as their stomachs longed for food. The camp itself seemed unremarkable at first glance. Rows of wooden barracks, barbed wire fences humming with cicadas, and guard towers rising like stubborn trees above the compound. But the moment of arrival branded itself not in the fences but in the sight of a 60-year-old American sergeant who leaned lazily on his rifle, his biceps still thick beneath rolled khaki sleeves. He smiled faintly, a flash of white teeth, as though greeting visitors to a fairground instead of captives of a brutal war. One of the women, a former student nurse from Yokohama, lowered her gaze quickly, ashamed at the way her eyes had lingered. In her notebooks, she had once written about health and anatomy, about the dream of becoming a healer. Now she scribbled nothing, but her thoughts returned to protein, to milk, to meat, words that had become fantasies in Japan. Here, these foods seemed to flow so easily that even old men consumed enough to hold back the years. An American war correspondent later noted that Japanese prisoners often stared not at the weapons or vehicles but at the rations. Cans of Spam stacked in pyramids, loaves of bread thick as a fist, steaming coffee poured freely. These were ordinary in the American camp, but to the prisoners, they seemed luxuries beyond reach. "We looked not at the guns," one Japanese soldier recalled, "but at the sandwiches." For the women, sandwiches would come later. First came the shock of faces. The guards talked among themselves in a rolling, easy English. To the women's ears, it sounded casual, unstrained, like the drawl of men who had never been pressed to the bone. One laughed at a joke about home, another adjusted his cap and winked at a companion. Their confidence felt not like arrogance but like the natural right of men whose bellies had never known true hunger. The women exchanged glances, each trying to conceal a flicker of envy. History would later record this contrast in numbers. By war's end, Japanese men in their 20s often weighed what American boys had at 14. Tuberculosis, rickets, and beriberi plagued conscripts. In America, posters urged citizens to drink milk, eat eggs, and keep strong for victory. The result stood in front of these POWs now, men who had aged differently, men whose very bones seemed built from abundance. Still, numbers cannot capture the strangeness of that moment. Imagine being 22, hair already brittle, body weakened by years of hunger, and then looking at a man almost 3 times your age who looked stronger, fresher, even younger than you. The humiliation was quiet, unspoken, but sharp as a blade. One of the women whispered to her neighbor, "If this is what their old men are like, what of their children?" It was not a question she wanted answered. The implication was too heavy. Perhaps this was why the empire had crumbled. Not because the Japanese lacked courage, but because the very bodies of their people had been starved into fragility while across the ocean, men aged like oak trees, hardening, not withering. As they filed past the guard line into the compound, the women tried to look away. But the images burned into them. The rifle slung casually by a man whose hair was more gray than black. The casual strength of another hoisting a crate. The laugh lines that looked less like wear and more like proof of long summers under a generous sun. In years to come, when some of these women told their children of captivity, they did not always mention the wire or the shame. They spoke of those guards. They spoke of how even the old Americans looked young. It was not just a curiosity. It was a revelation, unsettling as any bombing raid. It told them, in ways they could not deny, that the war had always been unequal, not only in planes and ships but in something as simple as daily bread. August 12, 1945. The war was nearly over, though its shadow lingered. For the women who crossed that threshold, the first impression of America was not the flag or the weapons. It was the bodies of men who defied age itself. They entered captivity with a new awareness, one that gnawed at their pride more deeply than hunger ever could. They did not yet know that inside the camp, their astonishment would only deepen. For what they saw next made them question not only the strength of these men, but the very foundation of their own world. The gates of the camp closed with a clang, sealing the women into a world that looked at once crude and astonishing. Rows of barracks stretched before them, built of rough planks and topped with tin roofs that rattled in the breeze. Dust swirled in the open spaces, mingling with the smell of sweat and diesel. Yet beneath the grit of war, something more powerful pressed against their senses: the smell of food. It was faint, carried on the air like a ghost, but undeniable: bread baking, meat sizzling on an unseen stove. The women froze, inhaling as though their very lungs might capture the memory to hold against hunger. Meals in wartime Japan had been meager, bowls of thin rice stretched with barley or root. The occasional fish head was a treasure, meat was almost mythical. But here, in a camp for prisoners, the scent of abundance lingered shamelessly in the air. It struck them not just as strange, but unfair. To be defeated was one humiliation. To be defeated by people who fed even their captives better than the Japanese army fed its soldiers was another wound altogether. The guards moved with their easy energy, still the embodiment of strength. One of them, a man the women guessed to be in his late 50s, hefted a wooden crate of supplies as though it were nothing. His forearms, tanned and corded with muscle, flexed under the weight. The Japanese women stared, unable to hide their astonishment. Their fathers, men of similar age, would have strained to carry such a burden. Here, an old man made it look effortless. A nurse among the group scribbled later in a hidden scrap of paper, "These men laugh while they eat bread thick as my hand. They drink milk each morning, as if it were water. Even our young men looked hollow by comparison." She was not exaggerating. Breakfast in the camp arrived with startling regularity. Thick slices of bread were stacked on tin trays, beside boiled eggs, steaming potatoes, and a pitcher of milk so white it looked like liquid chalk. To the American guards, this was ordinary, unremarkable. To the women, it was an almost mocking display of what separated victor from vanquished. The statistics would later confirm their eyes. In 1944, American farms produced over 23 billion pounds of meat and nearly 60 billion quarts of milk. Even with rationing, the average U.S. citizen consumed a quart of milk per day. In Japan, by that same year, milk had virtually disappeared from the civilian diet. Children were raised without it, their growth stunted by scarcity. It was no wonder, then, that the American Guards, even in their 60s, still carried the bulk and vigor of younger men. They had been built, year after year, on protein and fat. Inside the barracks, the women found thin mattresses, blankets, and crude wooden tables. Spartan, yes, but far beyond what they had braced for. They had expected straw on the ground, perhaps no roof at all. Instead, there was structure, order, and food enough to fill stomachs that had shrunk from years of deprivation. Hunger warred with pride as they lifted spoons of stew for the first time. The broth was thick, filled with chunks of beef and potatoes. One woman, barely 20, wept silently as she swallowed. She had forgotten what it felt like to chew real meat. The guards noticed the stares, though few said anything. Some smiled with a farmer's quiet amusement, others shrugged as if to say, "It's just supper." To the Americans, nothing was unusual about feeding prisoners this way. The Geneva Conventions required humane treatment, and beyond that, the American sense of plenty made stinginess almost unthinkable. But to the Japanese women, every spoonful carried a sting of comparison. Their own people, loyal to the emperor, starve. Here, as captives, they ate better than they had in freedom. The contrast gnawed at their identity. A woman who had once shouted slogans of sacrifice now found herself staring at a glass of milk, trembling with the desire to drain it to the last drop. She remembered that in school, teachers had described milk as a foreign indulgence, unnecessary for the Japanese body. Yet here she saw its truth, plain as bone. The men outside, laughing, strong, unbent by age, were the living proof of that white liquid's power. At night, whispers crept through the barracks. One asked if perhaps this was the secret to America's strength, not its bombs or ships, but its bread and bacon. Another suggested, bitterly, that Japan had sent its sons into battle already defeated, their bodies weakened before the war began. Silence often followed, heavy as the humid air. To admit such thoughts was to betray everything they had been taught. And yet, the evidence was there every morning, in the food, in the guards' stride, in the way even the oldest among them looked more vigorous than Japan's youth. A few of the women found their eyes drawn not only to the food, but to the men themselves. Their laughter was strange, not cruel but easy, as if war were only a job to be left at the gate. Some of the older guards teased one another about aches and pains, but even in jest, they radiated vitality. A woman barely 21 confessed to herself, shame burning her cheeks, that she had never seen such healthy men, not even among her peers at home. It was a betrayal of loyalty to think it, but she could not banish the thought. The conflict became not only external but internal, the war of image versus reality, of pride versus hunger, of belief versus sight. The empire had preached that endurance and spirit could overcome any obstacle. Yet here, endurance seemed built on calories, spirit bolstered by protein. Could spirit alone win against men whose very age seemed to defy time? The narrator of history must pause here to note the irony. The Americans themselves thought little of this. To them, old age meant continuing to work the farm, to coach the baseball team, to eat meatloaf on Sunday. They had no idea that their very bodies were teaching a lesson to their captive. For the Japanese women, however, every encounter pressed the wound deeper. Days passed, each meal reinforcing the contrast. With every plate of stew, with every glimpse of a guard lifting supplies, the women's perception shifted from shock to reluctant comprehension. This was not a temporary anomaly. This was the structure of a nation. America, for all its flaws, had raised generations on abundance. Japan, in its sacrifice, had unknowingly prepared its people for frailty. One afternoon, as the women watched an older guard haul 2 crates across the yard, a murmur spread among them. His hair was fully gray, yet his steps were quick, his chest broad beneath his uniform. One woman whispered, almost to herself, "If their old men are like this, then what of their young?" The others fell silent, for they knew the answer without daring to speak it. The question lingered like smoke, curling into the rafters of their thoughts. It was not just a curiosity anymore. It was a revelation with teeth, and the realization carried a new weight, that the true power of America might not be measured in bombs or battleships, but in the simple, relentless strength of men who never seemed to grow old. In the weeks that followed, the women began to see the camp as more than confinement. It was a mirror. Every routine, every guard stride, every tray of food forced them to compare 2 worlds, one built on scarcity, the other on plenty. The reflection was painful, but impossible to ignore. They rose at dawn, hearing the distant crackle of bacon on griddles meant for the guards. The smell carried across the compound, sharp and salty, announcing a wealth of pigs and farms they had never seen. For them, breakfast remained simpler: bread, stew, sometimes potatoes, but even that was richer than what they had known in Japan. The comparison was unavoidable. In Tokyo, families bartered kimonos for a handful of beans. Here, American cooks scraped leftovers into barrels with barely a thought. What the Japanese would have called a feast was waste in America. The guards embodied this difference. Their bodies were not only stronger but freer, shaped by lives without the same weight of want. Even when they complained, it was with a kind of casual luxury. One older man groaned about missing his wife's apple pie. Another muttered that camp coffee tasted like boiled sock. The women listened, astonished. In Japan, such complaints would have been unthinkable. Who would dare whine about pie in a nation where sugar had vanished years ago? The irony cut deep. Numbers sharpened the picture. Life expectancy in Japan by 1945 had fallen to 44 for men, 47 for women, a casualty of war, malnutrition, and disease. In America, it stood 2 decades higher, 63 for men, 67 for women. The statistics confirmed what the women saw with their own eyes: a people aging slower, standing taller, carrying strength into years when Japanese bodies often collapsed. These weren't abstract figures. They were the living guards who watched them each day, men old enough to be grandfathers yet able to run, laugh, and lift without breaking stride. The women whispered at night about what this meant. Some insisted America's strength was mechanical, its factories, its machines, its endless oil. Others said no, it was deeper. It was the food, the nourishment passed from mother to child, the abundance that shaped bones and flesh before a person even marched to war. A nurse, her voice quiet in the dark, confessed she had never tasted milk until the camp. "Perhaps," she murmured, "that is why they look young when they are old, and we look old when we are young." Silence followed, heavy with truth. For the Americans, the divide was invisible. They took their vitality as natural, as much a birthright as the flag stitched on their sleeves. One guard, 61, later recalled with bemusement, "They stared at me like I was some giant. But I was just a farmer's boy who drank milk every day of his life." To him, it was nothing special. To the prisoners, it was revelation. What struck them hardest was not cruelty. There was little of that, but ease. The guards joked with each other, argued over baseball, played cards in the evenings. Even in war, their lives seemed touched by comfort. Japan had trained its people to bear hardship with silence, to glorify sacrifice as a kind of victory. Here, the women saw no such ritual. Comfort was not shameful to the Americans. It was ordinary. That difference, subtle and cultural, carried an edge sharper than barbed wire. They began to realize the empire had fallen not just to bombs but to bread. The United States fed itself and its allies. Japan could barely feed its own. American schoolchildren drank milk in cafeterias while Japanese children withered. Abundance was invisible until seen beside absence. Now, in the camp, that absence pressed against them every day. Yet envy carried shadows of admiration. Some of the women began to study the guards quietly, almost academically, as though by observation they might uncover the secret of strength. They noted the way an older man stretched before his shift, or how another walked with long strides even when tired. They listened to the rhythm of their laughter. It was unforced, a sound they had almost forgotten existed. The contrast wasn't only physical, it was spiritual. Where scarcity had carved their spirits thin, abundance had given these men a surplus of ease, even humor. The humor stung most of all. Once, a guard joked about his aching back, prompting laughter from his comrades. The Japanese women exchanged glances. An aching back at 60 was ordinary, but the fact that this man could still laugh while hauling crates was extraordinary. In Japan, such laughter would have been replaced by resignation. Here, it became a sign of resilience. The camp became a classroom of unwanted lessons. Every slice of bread, every crate lifted by old hands, every joke shared across the yard deepened the understanding that nations were not only defined by armies and emperors but by the health of their people. The women, once proud of their endurance, now wondered if endurance alone had doomed them. Spirit could not replace calories. Devotion could not substitute for milk. And yet, to admit this fully was dangerous to the self. Pride lingered, stubborn as bone. Some women clung to the belief that Japan's sacrifice was nobler, that luxury softened the Americans while hardship hardened the Japanese. But in their hearts, the image of 60-year-old guards lifting with ease refused to leave. The mirror showed too much. The Americans, for their part, sometimes caught the stares. A few chuckled, misreading them as girlish glances of curiosity. Others ignored them altogether. None realized that their very existence was shaking the foundation of another culture's pride. As August turned to September, the camp settled into rhythm. The women grew less fearful, more accustomed, yet the unease deepened. This was no longer about war alone. It was about what the war had revealed. America and Japan were not simply enemies. They were opposites, reflections distorted by abundance and scarcity. The mirror forced recognition. One nation aged before its time, the other seemed to cheat time itself. The most haunting realization came during a late summer evening. The women watched a group of guards, some gray-haired, some bald, playing a rough game of catch with a baseball. They shouted, laughed, ran across the yard as if they were boys again. One of the prisoners whispered, almost trembling, "They are old men, yet they run like children." No one answered. The truth was too sharp. It was then the women began to wonder if the empire had demanded too much, if their sacrifice had been squandered by leaders blind to nourishment and blinded by pride. The mirror did not lie. It showed a future they could not claim. But what unsettled them most was still to come. For beyond the guards, beyond the games and the food, there lay a deeper revelation, one that would strip away not just pride but the very story they had been told about themselves. Autumn crept over the camp, softening the edges of summer's heat. The women marked time not by calendars but by the rhythm of meals, the tread of guards, and the silence that followed lights out. Days that should have blurred into sameness instead deepened into revelation. Each morning the smell of coffee and bacon drifted across the compound, mingling with the dew, and each evening the sound of laughter carried from the guards' barracks. It was in these ordinary moments that the women began to understand that the war had not been fought on equal ground. The realization arrived gradually, like a tide creeping higher. One morning, a guard in his early 60s sat on a crate and pulled off his boot to rub at a blister. His socks were thick, his foot strong, the veins prominent but not wasted. A woman watching through the fence thought of her father, once a proud craftsman in Yokohama, who had by that age been reduced to brittle bones, coughing from years of poor diet and cold winters without fuel. The image struck her like a betrayal. The empire had demanded endless sacrifice, But what had it given in return? Here was proof that another path had existed, one where age did not mean surrender. The Americans did not boast. They carried their strength as if it were natural, as ordinary as breathing. They drank milk without ceremony, ate meat without reverence, and aged into their 50s and 60s with bodies that still answered the call of labor. For the Japanese women, the lesson cut deeper than defeat in battle. It was the defeat of their bodies, of their everyday lives, of the belief that spirit alone could compensate for hunger. The statistics the women could not know then were already etched in ledgers. American soldiers averaged 5 to 6 inches taller than Japanese conscript. Tuberculosis had crippled nearly 10% of Japan's youth. By war's end, more than half the Japanese population suffered from chronic malnutrition. Yet in the camp, the facts were not numbers but faces. A 60-year-old sergeant could run across the yard chasing a baseball. A 58-year-old cook could lift a kettle brimming with stew as though it were an afterthought. These men were proof written in flesh. At night, conversations curled like smoke in the barrack. One woman whispered that she could never look at rice the same way again. Another admitted that when she returned home, if she returned, she would beg for milk for her children. Pride clashed with longing. To admire the enemy was disloyal, but to ignore the evidence was impossible. The mirror reflected more than weakness. It revealed the future that Japan might have had, and perhaps could still find. Some women carried bitterness sharper than hunger. They muttered that America's strength was built on theft, resources pulled from across oceans, colonies, and vast lands. Others, quieter, admitted that envy gnawed at them more than anger. One nurse remembered a professor who had once said nutrition was the hidden weapon of nations. At the time, she dismissed it as academic. Now she understood. War was not only bullets and bombs. It was bread, milk, and meat, stockpiled in silence long before the first shot was fired. A small moment crystallized this truth. One afternoon, a guard offered a group of women a basket of apples. Red, shiny, abundant. The women hesitated, then each took one. The first bite was sharp, sweet, and overwhelming. Some closed their eyes to hide tears. In Japan, fruit had become a luxury reserved for the sick or the wealthy. Here, it was handed out casually, without ceremony. A piece of fruit became an emblem of everything the war had laid bare. The Americans could not know the weight of these gestures. They believed they were being decent, perhaps even generous. But to the women, each act was double-edged, kindness and humiliation entwined. To be fed so well in captivity was to be shown how little they had been fed in loyalty. The empire had demanded their youth, their obedience, and in return it had starved them. The enemy gave them apples. The lesson grew sharper with time. Beyond the barbed wire, beyond the fences, a new Japan was being born. Word filtered in of surrender, of an emperor's voice broadcast over radio, of an occupation that would soon reshape everything they had known. For these women, the occupation began not with soldiers in the streets but with meals in the camp. Milk became more than nourishment. It became a symbol of a future they could not yet name, one where abundance might replace scarcity. But the knowledge was not easy to bear. Some wept quietly at night, mourning not only defeat but the years stolen from them by hunger. One wrote on a scrap of paper, "I am 23 and feel 60. They are 60 and feel 23. It was not hyperbole. It was the truth made visible each day. For the guards, the prisoners were simply part of duty, faces behind wire. For the prisoners, the guards became unwilling teachers. The lesson was not spoken but lived. It told them that nations were not only built on spirit, but on the invisible strength of everyday sustenance. It told them that resilience was measured not just in devotion but in the bodies of ordinary men who could carry crates, play ball, and laugh into old age. As winter approached, the women carried this awareness like an ember, smoldering beneath the surface. They did not know what Japan would become, only that it could never be the same. They had seen too clearly what abundance created. They had seen men who defied time. And yet, history's irony lingered. While America's strength had humbled them, it also offered a strange kind of hope. If nourishment could transform men, perhaps it could transform nations. Perhaps the future would not be only about bombs and battles, but about bread and milk, about a different kind of power. The women could not yet say it aloud, but the thought took root quietly, dangerously, like a seed waiting for spring. The story of their captivity was not one of cruelty or torture. It was the story of a mirror, held up by men too old to fight but too strong to ignore. In their faces, in their strength, the Japanese women saw the hidden foundation of victory. And in their own hunger they saw the cost of blind devotion. The lesson reached beyond the fence, beyond the camp, beyond even the war itself. It whispered that nations are shaped not only by ideals but by how they feed their children, how they care for their aging, how they prepare their people for the weight of life. For the women, that whisper became a roar inside their memory, impossible to silence. Years later, when they told their children of captivity, they spoke not of guards' cruelty but of their vitality. They described men in their 60s who looked younger than they did at 20. They spoke of apples, of bread, of milk, and of laughter echoing across a compound of shame. It was not bombs that haunted them, but abundance. And even as the war ended, as the world shifted, that memory lingered. The image of old Americans who looked young would remain a wound and a revelation. For in that sight lay the quiet truth of why one empire had fallen and another endured.